In the 1470s, the Old Swiss Confederacy and its allies clashed with the expansionist Burgundian Duke Charles the Bold in a series of armed confrontations. In the spring of 1476, Charles led his first campaign against the Old Swiss Confederacy. His army met the Swiss near the town of Grandson, was caught on the wrong foot, and fled. The Swiss found an immense amount of loot in the Burgundian field camp. According to an Old Swiss proverb, at Grandson, Charles lost his goods. However, he was all but defeated and recruited another army and marched towards the Swiss city of Bern again. When the Burgundians were besieging the town of Morat, which lay between them and Bern, the Swiss relief army attacked them. This time, the Burgundian defeat was devastating. Charles lost almost his entire army, and he himself escaped only by the skin of his teeth. At Morat, the proverb continues: Charles lost his bravery. This video is the fourth installment in a series on the Burgundian Wars, and explains how contemporary historiography recounts the Battle of Nancy. Despite the defeat at Grandson and the disaster at Morat, Charles didn't consider himself beaten. Before the year 1476 came to an end, he recruited yet another army to take revenge on the Swiss. He wanted to beat the Swiss with their own weapons, that is, with an army centered around infantry. However, according to Hans Delbrück, a famous military historian of the first half of the 20th century, Charles didn't simply copy the Swiss tactics, but actually improved the interplay of his military arms by putting infantry at its core. Recruitment, however, went slowly because his allies and vassals were not inclined to send their men to a swift death at the end of a Swiss pike. In the meantime, a revolt arose in the occupied territory of Lorraine. Rebels led by the Duke René II of Lorraine and supported by the Lower League reconquered one Burgundian garrison after another, most importantly the city of Nancy on the 6th of October. The Duchy of Lorraine was vital to Charles's ambitions because it connected his home territory to the Burgundian Netherlands. He had no choice but to lead the rest of his army against the rebellion first. Although he raised only 12,000 men, he vastly outnumbered the rebel army because René lacked money and wasn't able to pay his soldiers. His army's morale was bad, mutiny common, and desertions numerous. He was on the verge of losing his territory to Charles once more. On the 22nd of October, Charles arrived at the city of Nancy and laid siege to it. The defenses of the place had been damaged during the reconquering and were not completely repaired yet. However, the Burgundians had only a small number of artillery at hand, and the men from Lorraine constantly harassed them by ambushing and cutting off their supply lines. In this desperate situation, René turned to his Swiss allies for help. However, the Old Swiss Confederacy was fed up with the wars against Charles and wanted to come to terms with him. The Tagsatzung, known in English as the Federal Diet of Switzerland, declined René's request for help. Only when he received financial support from the cities of Alsace and the Lower League, who both feared that Charles would once more get hold of Lorraine and torment them from there, could René convince the Swiss to allow him to recruit mercenaries in their territory. Unexpectedly, the recruitment was very successful. Instead of the 5,000 to 6,000 men he had aimed for, he was joined by 8,400 Swiss mercenaries. However, a large part of them was very young and inexperienced. Some were even repelled because they were too young. The Swiss mercenaries gathered at Basel and left for Alsace on the 26th of December. During their march north, although in Allied territory, the Swiss wreaked havoc. They plundered and robbed the local people, who were already suffering due to a rough, cold winter. At Lunéville, the army was joined by the contingents of the Lower League, adding up to about 20,000 men. They reached Saint-Nicolas-du-Port, a village 10 kilometers south of Nancy, on the 4th of January 1477. On the same day, they held a council of war. Because of the dire situation in Nancy, the limited opportunities to gather supplies, and the numerical superiority over the Burgundian army, they decided to attack Charles immediately on the following day. When the Burgundian Duke heard of the approaching relief army, he immediately withdrew a large part of his force from the siege. Only a small contingent remained behind to keep up the siege and prevent the defenders from falling in his rear. Charles had come up with a plan, which allowed him to go toe-to-toe with the numerically superior relief army. The road from Saint-Nicolas-du-Port to Nancy ran along a valley. Near the village of Charleville, the valley was 400 to 500 meters wide and enclosed by steep, wooded hillsides. The area was closed off to the northeastern side by the river Meurthe. The Ruisseau de Charleville, a rivulet surrounded by dense undergrowth, formed a natural obstacle across the valley. Charles took position behind this creek and set up his army in between the river and the steep hillside on the southwestern flank. There he waited for the approaching enemy in a strong defensive position. The center of the Burgundian battle formation consisted of infantry, including dismounted men-at-arms, crossbowmen, archers, and Charles's personal guard. The artillery was positioned right in front of the center and focused on a choke point of the valley, from where the enemy was expected to move in. The cavalry covered both flanks of the formation. This position had all the advantages and disadvantages that come with such a narrow choke point. While it allowed Charles to compensate for his smaller numbers to some extent and focus the strike power of his army on one point, it limited the mobility of both armies. Additionally, Charles's only possibility of retreat was blocked by the city of Nancy, which, despite being under siege, was an obstacle to any orderly retreat. On the morning of the 5th of January, a cold and wet winter day, the army of René of Lorraine and his allies marched towards Nancy. About 15 minutes away from the Burgundian lines, they stopped to scout the enemy's position, prepare for battle, and hold a last council of war. The leaders of the relief army realized that Charles's position was too strong for a frontal attack. Therefore, they decided to send only a group of 800 gunmen, the rear guard, directly towards the blockade to distract the Burgundians, while in fact, the main assault should be led from both flanks. Because the terrain on both sides was so difficult, the artillery was left in the camp. The Allies would not fall for Charles's trap. Around noon, the main force, consisting mainly of Swiss mercenaries and numbering about 9,000 men, set out for their difficult march ahead. Densely driving snow and thick fog covered them, while they slowly advanced arduously on snow and ice, through thick woods and along the steep slope. It took them about 2 hours to beat the short distance and finally arrive on the hill above the Burgundians. Soon, the snow ceased to fall, the fog dissolved, and the Swiss sounded their horns. Roaring battle cries echoed through the valley while they stormed down the hill and attacked the Burgundian right flank. The Burgundians, taken by surprise because the enemy approached from a seemingly unapproachable side, tried hastily to turn their guns. They were too slow and fired only a couple of badly aimed shots in the direction of the assailing Swiss pikes. The cavalry on the Burgundian right came running to help them out and managed to halt the attack for a short while, before they were pushed back by the Swiss pikemen. Subsequently, Charles ordered his archers to hurry to the right flank. However, before they had finished their movement, the approaching pike square clashed into the Burgundian infantry. Only moments after the main force of the Allies rushed down the hill, the vanguard of 7,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, who had bypassed the Burgundian position under the cover of snow and fog along the Meurthe, approached the left flank of the Burgundians. After they had already outflanked the Burgundian guns, which were still focused on the choke point of the valley, they charged the Burgundian left flank without hesitation. They now faced the counterattack of the Burgundian horsemen. But after a short and bloody struggle, the Burgundian cavalry was repelled and routed. Deprived of its main tactical pillars, namely artillery and cavalry, the Burgundian army fought a frantic fight. However, soon the numerical superiority of the Allied attackers began to show, and the Burgundian infantry broke apart and melted away in flight. In the meantime, The garrison of Nancy had made a sortie, set Charles's camp aflame, and keenly awaited the fleeing Burgundians. The only remaining direction for flight was the partly frozen river Meurthe, in which many Burgundians found a cold and wet grave. According to the Swiss historian Hans Stadler, all in all, about 6,000 Burgundians were killed in the carnage. The last battle of Burgundy was lost. When Charles the Bold recognized the situation was beyond salvation, to flight he turned quickly. His persecutors on his track, off his horse he was pulled swiftly. 2 lances to his body and a halberd cracked his head. Charles the Bold of Burgundy was dead. On the 7th of January, Charles's body was found near a pond, some 100 meters off the battlefield. René of Lorraine had him buried like a trophy in his court chapel. Later, the burial case was transferred to the Church of Our Lady in Bruges. Along with Charles the Bold, the Burgundian realm came to an end. Burgundy remained without a regent. Soon, the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor began to fight over it. Charles lost his goods at Grandson, his bravery at Morat, and his blood at Nancy. Karl der Kühne verlor bei Grandson das Gut, bei Murten den Mut und bei Nancy das Blut. This famous saying, which is widely known up to this day, sums up the events of the Burgundian Wars concisely. According to the historian André Hollenstein, its first traces, although in a slightly different wording, can be found immediately after the Battle of Nancy. It is evidence for the importance of the events of the years in between 1474 and 1477. According to Claudius Sieber-Lehmann, it marked a turning point not only for the Swiss, but also for Europe. The balance of power shifted drastically. The Burgundian Empire ceased to exist. France's political importance grew, and most importantly, the House of Habsburg gained momentum in the process of becoming the major power of the 16th century. Additionally, the Burgundian Wars laid the foundation of the Swiss rise to military power in their own right. In terms of territory, the cantons of the Old Swiss Confederacy didn't gain much. Soon, they returned Vaud to Savoy in exchange for 50,000 guilders. They also sold their claims to Franche-Comté to King Louis XI of France. Only a handful of the conquered towns remained in the hands of the Swiss cities of Bern and Fribourg, most importantly Morat, Échallens and Grandson. In contrast, the social changes initiated by these military encounters with Burgundy were way more far-reaching. Thanks to the victories at Grandson, Morat and Nancy, the Swiss combat skills became famed throughout the continent, which propelled them to the very top of the mercenary market. This had an immense impact on Swiss politics, social structure and everyday life. The rise of the Reisläufer after the Burgundian Wars, that is, of Swiss mercenaries fighting for foreign powers, not only changed the face of the Old Swiss Confederacy, but also European warfare strongly and lastingly.